We are Ana Rodriguez, she's Ana Rodriguez Granel, and I am Marina Hoffman, and we will chair the session B, Divergent Histories Departing from Matter. This session proposes to challenge, intentionally unbalance, and even erase the dichotomy discourse-matter in many divergent ways. In order to see what happens with history, if we start from matter, or at least if we consider matter seriously, but also to open up other issues that a change of perspective might bring to the table of discussion. For instance, which other elements apart from matter have been forgotten in art history? Some places maybe, some technologies, some inventors, processes, why they have been forgotten, and from which frames of thought can we address these ignored issues? We will listen now to 5 inspiring presentations of 15 minutes each, and we will leave questions and discussion for the end of the session. Espero que tengamos tiempo. Ana va a presentar a los invitados.
Hola, buenas tardes. Bueno, pues empezamos con Lucía Egaña Rojas, de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, y Valentina Montero, de la Universidad de Barcelona, con la ponencia Precarias, híbridas y utópicas. Gracias.
Bueno, no vamos a perder ningún poco de tiempo porque hay apuro y a nosotras nos gusta hablar bastante, así que vamos a cronometrar la presentación. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación, por organizar también este congreso lleno de temas así bien interesantes. Voy a empezar leyendo un pequeño fragmento que presenta un poco de lo que vamos a hablar. Sorry to the English speakers, but we will do the presentation in Spanish. Empiezo. Instalaciones que no funcionan, basura tecnológica reutilizada, imágenes distorsionadas, hijas del azar que el error permite, electrodomésticos y juguetes electrónicos hackeados, máquinas atadas con alambres que en su improvisado ensamblaje alertan un inminente peligro de cortocircuito y blackout, pero que al mismo tiempo sacan chispas y alumbran intermitentemente utopías de bajo voltaje. Algo así se ve en el panorama del arte de los medios en muchos puntos de América Latina y su diáspora. Pero lejos de constituir una letanía, la enumeración de los fallos, anomalías, precariedades y trucos pobres que caracterizan a muchas propuestas artísticas de la región, al mismo tiempo van describiendo una impronta particular en la que cristaliza una historia común y una demanda que pavimenta nuevos espacios de encuentro y participación al margen de las instituciones, y que otorga la materialidad de los objetos híbridos producidos desde la convergencia entre saberes tecnológicos, bricolaje, arte y diseño, un rol activo.
Bueno, esto como introducción para situar más o menos desde dónde estamos focalizando el tema de la precariedad. Nos interesa sobre todo comprender la precariedad como una condición contextual vinculada a la pobreza económica, escasez de recursos y conocimientos que caracterizaría a la región latinoamericana, pero que vamos a ver que no tiene que ver con una cuestión económica netamente, sino que también con todo un condicionamiento ideológico que se dio sobre todo desde los años 60 en Latinoamérica, cuando se coartaron ciertas intenciones de actualización tecnológica con un objetivo claramente de mantener cierta dependencia. Pero también nos interesa resaltar la precariedad como una posición político-ideológica que también es transversal no solamente a Latinoamérica, sino que también lo vemos en Europa y que tiene que ver con un cuestionamiento a algunos conceptos que se instalan, que se naturalizan, que tienen que ver con esta idea del progreso, ¿no? De la idea de la modernidad, la idea del fetichismo high-tech, ¿no? Entonces, esta forma, la precariedad vendría a ser un ejercicio como de resistencia también. Y también nos interesa la precariedad como una opción también de corte estético-filosófica, pues con esto se valoraría la dimensión poética y material, también que tendrían los objetos y los procesos de experimentación, resaltando desde ahí entonces no solamente estos objetos tecnológicos como a usarse, sino que también como teniendo una especie de agencia que permitiría generar una poética a partir de ellos. Hablar de la tecnología, arte y tecnología en Latinoamérica es problemático si partimos de esta idea justamente de que no hay desarrollo tecnológico en los países latinoamericanos, o sea, todos fueron cortados desde los años 60, como dije anteriormente, pero para el ámbito de las artes, de los medios, esto viene a ser quizás mucho más sensible, ¿no? Acá presentar un poco como una ironía, pero un poco para describir qué pasa con esto de arte y tecnología. una propuesta artística de Lázaro Saavedra, un artista cubano que genera esta galería que es mucho más extensa de esta galería email, donde él hace esta Nokia con cámara fotográfica y vibrador, Ericsson con varios juegos, Nokia con memoria adicional y timbre con música de los 70, Nokia de última generación con cámara. ¿No? Esto un poco viene a reflejar también esa condición, ¿no? Esa condición de precariedad, cómo se puede hacer, por ejemplo, cómo se podía hacer net art en Cuba en condiciones que no había internet libre. Y sin embargo se hacía, ¿no? Se hacía, pero buscando como un poco el truco, el hechizo. Esta pregunta por lo latinoamericano y por la relación entre la tecnología y lo latinoamericano, nosotros la podríamos rastrear desde muy anterior, desde muy tempranamente, ya con las primeras vanguardias en el siglo XX, nosotros podíamos observar que de alguna manera en Latinoamérica se replicaba esa euforia que tenía la tecnología entrando en el campo artístico. Ya nosotros podríamos ver en las primeras vanguardias desde el punto de vista literario, sobre todo, que es lo que primero podían atacar, podíamos ver movimientos como el estridentista, el movimiento euforista, donde todos exaltaban esta idea de la máquina. Pero ya, si bien tenía ciertos aspectos interesantes, como por ejemplo una idea latinoamericanista y la pretensión de que podría haber una especie de conjunción entre estas ideas de vanguardia europea mezcladas con un indigenismo o con una conciencia latinoamericana, ya también habían voces que daban alerta respecto a esta apología quizá excesiva respecto a la idea de la máquina. Desde el campo poético, como vimos antes a Huidobro, también Juan Emar dice: no basta hacer cubismo para ser joven y la fabricación de futurismo no coloca forzosamente su autor en el futuro. Pero quizás de manera mucho más enfática las palabras de Gabriela Mistral, poeta chilena, premio Nobel, dice: sensibilidad nueva significa mirada inédita, pero que cae sobre las cosas con que nos codeamos, sea huerto o majada. Me hacen sonreír algunos libros que llegan de rincones ruralísimos de América. Están atravesados, están veteados de fabrilismo, de maquinismo, de Torre Eiffel, de Picassos y de Paul Morans, y han sido pensados mientras se oía la rumia búdica de las vacas o el cordón lacio del agua de riego. Esto nos muestra un poco la necesidad también de repensar la inserción de la tecnología desde los contextos locales, ¿no? Y desde o sea, un poco tratar de mirar con equilibrio esta idea entre una utopía acerca de la máquina y una distopía, en esta idea como de tecnofobia o tecnofilia, ¿no? Que es más o menos lo que hemos notado nosotros, que en las últimas décadas muchas corrientes de artistas, y no solamente de artistas, sino que también de sectores periféricos con el diseño, están tratando de plantear como una temática.
Bien, vamos a entrar en materia más contemporánea, luego de estas citas antiguas. Vamos a abordar 3 proyectos, algunos ya desaparecidos o en vías de extinción. El primer proyecto que vamos a revisar es el colectivo Mini-Pimer TV, que precisamente trabaja en el limbo entre la tecnofobia y la tecnofilia, como comentaba Valentina. Comienza siendo un colectivo de streaming que en ese sentido de alguna manera permitía como cierta emergencia de la máquina, en el sentido que en el streaming hecho con software libre pueden aparecer muchas cosas que no están planificadas, ¿no? Y en ese sentido el trabajo de Mini-Pimer muchas veces generaba ciertos dispositivos que hacían que de una u otra forma emergieran situaciones muy erróneas, ¿no? En esta imagen vemos un software realizado para tomar decisiones en colectivo, cosa que evidentemente no funciona, ¿no? No se pueden maquinizar las tomas de decisiones colectivas. Este otro proyecto tiene que ver con una máquina que interviene los estados emocionales de las personas, un disruptor de ondas cerebrales que evidentemente jugaba mucho sobre la capacidad de alguna forma como de convencimiento que podía ejercer la máquina sobre quienes usaban el aparato. Y sobre todo lo que queríamos resaltar del trabajo de este ejemplo era la generación de elementos que pudiesen evidenciar el cómo estaban hechos las cosas, todos estos circuitos abiertos, y que es una cosa que se repite también en todos los proyectos de alguna forma que estamos trabajando, que estamos revisando. Y en este caso, como la posibilidad de exponer los fallos, los errores, como una manera también de generar conocimientos colectivos o formas, herramientas para que los distintos colectivos puedan aprender también, ¿no? En general, muchos proyectos de arte con tecnología evitan la exposición del error, evitan todo lo que sucede en el proceso, y esto de alguna forma también impide, ¿no?, que se pueda aprender de cómo están hechas las cosas. En ese sentido, todo este proyecto, por ejemplo, todo este circuito abierto, todos estos cables expuestos, de alguna manera dejan abierta la posibilidad del fallo, pero también exponen el funcionamiento de manera como muy directa.
Claro, y en esa misma línea de exponer en el fondo cómo están construidas las cosas, otro proyecto que fue muy interesante, el BIS, que era un taller de bricolaje sexual, que fue realizado desde el año 2005 hasta ahora, porque se ha seguido haciendo esos talleres más o menos interrumpidamente. Orit Kruglansky de Israel y Carla Peirano de Chile empezaron este proyecto donde lo que hacían era básicamente un taller donde se invitaba a mujeres a hackear electrodomésticos con el fin de realizar juguetes sexuales. Tenía varios objetivos este proyecto. Por un lado estaba la idea justamente de empoderar a las mujeres con la tecnología, porque así como existe una brecha entre países respecto al acceso a la tecnología, también hay una brecha de género importante. Pero también estaba la idea de compartir ciertos imaginarios en torno a lo que es la sexualidad. Se contrastaba también esta idea del imaginario como de los medios, de la pornografía mainstream, en relación a los deseos y las pretensiones que tenía cada mujer de manera más íntima. Había un choque ahí, pero estaba esta idea también de mostrarle la cercanía a la tecnología, de cómo en el fondo la tecnología no es solamente el dispositivo high-tech que está ahí expuesto en alguna exposición ahí en Londres, sino que también tiene que ver con la tecnología que nos rodea en el uso cotidiano. Este proyecto además se bordeaba en lo que era el sistema del arte, o sea, se daba en ayuntamientos, no tenía una pretensión de entrar dentro del museo. Pasemos la otra. Y también había una necesidad en el fondo de vincular una especie de práctica revolucionaria, pero justamente desde el espacio como de lo doméstico. Este proyecto fue muy interesante porque, claro, generó esa respuesta de muchos de que esto no es arte, de que esto es algo indecente, pero sobre todo también estaba la posibilidad de vincular la tecnología también con una cuestión corporal, con una cuestión de los deseos, de esas cosas que no están en los medios o que están solamente para algunos, y también de recuperar en el fondo la oportunidad de usar esos objetos tecnológicos, los vibradores, para gente que no tenía acceso a comprarlo porque terminan siendo también objetos de lujo o que tienen una censura ya por una cuestión social, un poco ahí de represión interna. Otro proyecto que queríamos comentar, bueno, primero introducirlo ahí había un pintor en principios del siglo XX en Chile, el primero que logró exponer en la Tate Gallery, y en la época de entreguerras, él muy atormentado, cuenta Pablo Neruda que este pintor Álvaro Chileno Guevara le decía que tenía la solución para acabar con las guerras y podía acabar con el hambre en el mundo, la solución era que cada persona plantara una papa, una patata. Si cada persona plantaba una patata, entonces se acababa el hambre del mundo. Curiosamente, años después, en Argentina, Víctor Gripo desarrolla justamente a partir de los objetos más, o sea, de los productos más locales, más propios de lo que es América del Sur, utiliza una papa, pero justamente para buscar un uso alternativo a ella, que sería la extracción de energía eléctrica a partir de una papa. Esto lo conectamos luego con el proyecto Chimbalab, que Chimbalab es un colectivo de artistas que se empezó el año 2007 y que la Chimbalab venía por un poco un remedio también a esta fiebre que empezó a aparecer de los Media Labs, ¿no? La Chimba era un barrio es un barrio en el sector de Santiago, en la parte norte, al otro lado del río, que se caracterizó siempre por ser un lugar de marginalidad, donde estaban los primeros los indígenas que eran más o menos sometidos, después sería un lugar donde estaba el mercado de abastos, pero también está el cementerio, donde también está el psiquiátrico, y ellas establecen en una casa que se estaba cayendo a pedazos este taller, ¿no? Y desde ahí empiezan a generar una especie de poner en colectivo prácticas que la gente sabía, prácticas electrónicas. Y uno de los proyectos que realizan, que es el que estábamos viendo, de la emisora, el proyecto emisora, que lo hicieron justamente después del terremoto en Chile del año 2010, cuando cayeron todos los sistemas de comunicación no servían los móviles, no servía, ¿cierto?, la internet, y lo único que funcionaba para que la gente se comunicara era la radio. Entonces hicieron este proyecto utilizando las patatas de ese mercado de abastos para generar también comunicación entre los vecinos, o sea, buscando en esta idea utópica de pensar cómo las prácticas excepcionales que significa la experimentación de arte y tecnología podría ofrecer también una posibilidad de empoderamiento local ante las catástrofes.
Bien, se están acabando los 15 minutos, entonces para concluir, en general hemos hablado de proyectos que más que tratar una lógica do it yourself en el sentido de hazlo tú mismo, como funciona quizás un mueble de Ikea, se trata de más bien prácticas que están como bastante enraizadas en la cultura y que toman ciertos elementos incluso del folclore, de lo local, del espacio, del contexto que genera ese proyecto, y de una manera de usar la tecnología que quizás podríamos ver también en ciertas formas, en ciertos gestos, como serían en el contexto del Estado español la chapuza o el apaño, en Brasil la gambiarra o la herramienta hechiza de Chile. Estos proyectos trabajan un poco desde ese lugar. También se trata de proyectos que ponen mucho énfasis en la horizontalidad del trabajo, en un trabajo y en un aprendizaje colectivo. Por otro lado, son proyectos que de alguna forma tienen que ver con la cocina o que entienden lo tecnológico como algo que se expande mucho más allá de lo que es exclusivamente una máquina, que recuperan elementos del espacio doméstico, de la cocina, como dice la imagen, o que tienen que ver incluso con comida. De alguna forma es mantener una relación con la tecnología mucho más vinculada a la vida cotidiana también y a los espacios en los que vivimos continuamente, y unos tipos de tecnología que no son habitualmente reconocidos oficialmente por las instituciones que trabajan exclusivamente con tecnología como algo separado, ¿no? Y por otro lado, los proyectos de los que hemos hablado son proyectos que trabajan con código abierto, con software libre o con hardware libre, y todos operan de una manera también que realmente intenta abrir el código de producción de trabajo. Son proyectos que realizan constantemente tutoriales de cada proyecto que hacen y que se fijan de alguna forma mucho más en los procesos de producción que en las piezas acabadas, como una pieza cerrada que está como bastante, o sea, que las piezas no están emancipadas de su producción ni de su contexto de producción.
Eso. Nos pasamos 1 minuto con 17 segundos.
Ay,
así que
nos callamos.
Gracias.
La modernidad puede entenderse como un proceso de descontextualización que compone un marco de separación entre espacio y tiempo, dentro del que se ensaya un proceso de individualización en las formas de la subjetividad, ligados a un cuestionamiento de las formas de socialización. Se trata de un esfuerzo de separación normativa entre objetos, artefactos, personas, entre modos de experimentar el mundo, entre el conocimiento racional asociado a las altas culturas de la lectoescritura y la reflexividad y el conocimiento figurativo, las culturas visuales masivas y populares, basado en la experiencia sensual del mundo, que se relega en el conjunto de ese proyecto a una minoría de edad anclada en lo masivo, lo feminizado o lo supersticioso. Sin embargo, ese mismo movimiento de especialización de esferas, que podría ser las exposiciones universales, por ejemplo, de esferas de conocimiento y trabajo, percepción y atención, desveló las dimensiones que quedaban marginadas. Karen Norsetina ha señalado que esos márgenes no atendidos toman relieve cuando atendemos a cómo esos amplios fenómenos de descontextualización han pretendido incluir normativamente a las relaciones humanas, pero han olvidado el hecho de que ese proceso ha estado unido a una expansión y multiplicación de entornos centrados en objetos, artefactos, instrumentos que definen sus identidades con la misma pregnancia que la de las comunidades modernas de pertenencia y legitimación, atravesando y modelando los procesos de socialización y subjetivización. Se trata, en efecto, de entender que la intensificación y a la vez debilitación de los procesos de individualización propios de la modernidad, los seres humanos, los objetos, las cosas, los artefactos, entran en un plano igualitario y de articulación constante, como partes de relaciones parciales y entornos de situación. Lo que Norsetina llama relaciones de objeto pierden sus contornos definidos para componer formas de relación en las que se modifican y hasta se reemplazan las relaciones humanas. Esta es una problematización de la afirmación que resume la modernidad como un proceso de desencantamiento del mundo, porque si en efecto ese proceso se ha intensificado, al mismo tiempo se multiplican las situaciones y las áreas en las que los individuos se relacionan con ciertos objetos, no solamente como medios o instrumentos para la acción y el pensamiento, sino como seres que experimentan, sienten, reflexionan, recuerdan, interactúan o muestran agencia. Los traders... Bueno, esto es un ejemplo de la forma en que los objetos toman vida, estos famosos grabados de Granville, del grabador francés, en que en la modernidad pues, algunos objetos toman vida, ¿no? Se transforman en personas, etc. Los traders en los mercados de inversión bursátil, los científicos en el laboratorio, los usuarios de objetos digitales complejos, como simulaciones, interfaces, o los participantes en un Media Lab, en redes de conocimiento, los estudiantes en las aulas de las escuelas y en las universidades, actúan en contextos que, si bien se encuentran profundamente desencantados, están a la vez poblados por esas entidades sin definición cumplida que Norsetina llama objetos epistémicos, y a los que aquellos actores no pueden evitar atribuir puntualmente características, memoria, agencia, reflexividad que la extinción moderna había reservado solo a los humanos. Estos objetos, su presencia en una variedad de entornos, vienen a desafiar las aproximaciones objetivistas y sus modelos de representación retirada y desinteresada de las cosas. Ellos no se ajustan ya a la epistemología objetivista porque sus contornos no son nítidos, son procesos en marcha que, en caso de definir algo, lo hacen en la forma de una interrogación que reclama un pensamiento de la complejidad. Su presencia es efectiva pero incierta, inacabada, presentan una falta de completud y de objetividad. Son instancias materiales, pero también estructuras de ausencias que se despliegan indefinidamente, hacen de las situaciones que recorren no totalidades cerradas, sino entornos abiertos construidos provisionalmente en base a una multiplicidad de conexiones parciales. Así que lo que aquí queda expuesto es ese desplazamiento que va desde la representación a la articulación entre humanos, no humanos, artefactos, imágenes, cosas, sistemas expertos, modalidades de conocimiento y experiencia, relaciones sociopolíticas. Pero no se trata en este punto, como recuerda el antropólogo Eduardo Ibeiros de Castro, de celebrar la evolución de las fronteras que unen, separándolos, los signos y el mundo, las personas y las cosas, nosotros y ellos, humanos y no humanos. Sino se trata, en cambio, de irreducir e indefinir esos términos, para que esas líneas de separación se plieguen sobre sí mismas en una curva infinitamente compleja, no tanto para borrar los contornos como para difractarlos, complejizarlos. No hay duda que con la crítica a los modos objetivistas de representación retorna una desconfianza para con los poderes del lenguaje que puede rastrearse una multitud de planteamientos dentro de las humanidades contemporáneas, desde la revisión del concepto de presencia al estudio de los cruces entre materialidad y visualidad. Karen Barad subraya la necesidad de reconocer las dimensiones materiales del conocimiento para desubstancializar el lenguaje y, a través de la comprensión performativa de las prácticas discursivas, desafiar el dogma representacionalista que concede a las palabras el poder de representar las cosas como ya preexistentes, no construidas. Por su parte, Kate Moxey también ha detectado dentro del ámbito de los estudios visuales esa desconfianza respecto al lenguaje que podría tomarse como una forma de oponer la materialidad a los procesos de virtualización contemporánea de las imágenes, las cosas, los objetos y finalmente de la propia experiencia del mundo. Todavía no. Sin embargo, fallaríamos al permanecer en esa simple oposición que debe ser matizada, si bien señala un creciente interés en diversos ámbitos del análisis cultural, ciencias humanas y sociales, por entender el poder de los objetos y las imágenes, sus formas de agencia o sus lenguas. Investigar las intersecciones entre lo visual y lo material significa entonces hacerlo no en los términos de una lógica de cohabitación, y menos aún en una dualista, sino más bien de co-constitución, como dice Gillian Rose, por ejemplo. Teorizar las interrelaciones entre materialidad y visualidad en ese sentido conlleva poner en crisis los paradigmas y posiciones tradicionales de la investigación y la interpretación para enfrentarlos polémicamente a las cuestiones de la mediación, el lugar, la ética, el consumo, la apropiación, la práctica y la traducción. Querría ahora adoptar otro punto de vista para entender esas articulaciones entre humanos, no humanos, artefactos, etc., en base a su inclusión dentro de los tres regímenes que, con respecto al arte y las imágenes, ha propuesto distinguir Jacques Rancière. El primero es el régimen ético de las imágenes, el segundo el poético y el tercero es el régimen estético. El primero hace referencia al poder de influencia de las imágenes más allá de los límites conceptuales de las disciplinas del arte. Las imágenes aquí se definen en referencia a su declinación pragmática, su eficacia en las esferas de lo ético, lo social, lo político, su papel en el modelado de los espectadores. Pasando por el segundo régimen, que está ligado al criterio mimético y a los placeres del parecido, llegaríamos al régimen estético, que involucrado en los ya mencionados procesos de separación modernos o segregación modernos, va a reubicar a las imágenes de acuerdo a su valor como objetos sensibles acotados dentro del juicio estético y del gusto, y por tanto liberados de obligaciones ético-pragmáticas. El régimen estético del arte consolida así una discontinuidad entre formas sensibles de producción artística y las formas sensibles a través de las que aquellas son propiedad del espectador, oyente o lector. Se abre así una distancia normativa institucionalizada, por ejemplo, por los museos entre la obra de arte y el espectador y sus formas de recepción. El artista sería un especialista en un medio, en una disciplina que produce obras con bordes nítidos, que exponen, interrumpiendo la normalidad, un momento de aislamiento, de fragmentación con respecto a sus vínculos espaciotemporales a los que cuestiona. Pero no podríamos reconocer hoy un cierto retorno del régimen ético. No estamos entrando en un régimen de visualidad que parece más acorde con las características de aquel primer estatuto de la imagen. Han vuelto a ganar densidad, desbordando límites institucionales y separaciones disciplinarias, las dimensiones pragmáticas de la imagen, el problema de su eficacia simbólica y performativa, de sus poderes para afectar, crear socialización y conocimiento. Reinaldo Ladaga propone llamar a este momento un nuevo régimen práctico de las artes, en el que por las transformaciones en la esfera del trabajo, la subjetividad, la emergencia de la red, la globalización, las obras de arte, si es que podemos seguir llamándolos así, son más bien elaboraciones de ambientes, situaciones, ecologías culturales, transformaciones en un espacio de posibilidades, comunidades experimentales, creaciones de vivo, laboratorios en los que se ensayan nuevas formas existenciales, modos de vida y de hacer mundo. Y donde decimos una mutación en el régimen de visualidad, decimos más bien la emergencia de articulaciones complejas entre imágenes y materialidad, artefactos, objetos, redes de conocimiento, discursos, prácticas. Las separaciones entre estos y otros términos ya no son operativas. Lo material es modelado según un determinado régimen visual que dicta lo que es invisible y visible, cuerpos y prácticas que merecen atención, mientras que lo visual se compone como un modo material del discurso que afecta a lo real. La experiencia de lo inmaterial está mediada también por los artefactos, mientras que estos están mediados por los imaginarios tecnológicos. Pero no se trataría de un simple retorno de aquel régimen ético. Este se encuentra filtrado por la experiencia de la modernidad, es decir, por las promesas emancipatorias no cumplidas de la Ilustración, que acabaron relegadas al ámbito de la idea estética. Quiero decir que cuando reconocemos el regreso de ese régimen ético, también estamos reconociendo la posibilidad de alcanzar la realización del proyecto crítico ilustrado, el régimen estético, recuperado en el orden de una formalización efectiva para ser usada por las tradiciones del pensamiento crítico como herencia y valor propio, que es lo que decía José Luis Brea, su último libro. Aquí se están dibujando entonces las condiciones de un conocimiento no separado, no dominado por los imperativos de la representación o la disciplina, la norma o la propiedad, que se abre al encuentro igualitario y productivo de lo ajeno con lo ajeno, de los datos y las prácticas, las perspectivas y los discursos, los objetos, los artefactos, las imágenes y las palabras. Esta es, por supuesto, una posibilidad no realizada. La ficción de lo contemporáneo, recuerda a Peter Osborne, es la de una transnacionalidad global impulsada por el capital que se autoproclama como única instancia capaz de proyectar un horizonte utópico de interconexión global, pero para refutarlo inmediatamente y abstraer así la posibilidad de una colectividad política y de conocimiento transnacional real. La libre circulación de personas, imágenes, objetos es la ensoñación que el capital expone en el escenario de un sistema mundo cumplido sin resto. Dentro de tal escenario se ubica también al conocimiento, al que se considera las mismas condiciones de libre circulación que el propio capital, el cual al mismo tiempo encontró en aquel una nueva veta de creación de beneficio. Al igual que la comunidad política desarticulada por el capital en la forma de mercado está siempre aún por venir, así también la comunidad inmanente de conocimiento, abstraída bajo los rótulos de la sociedad del conocimiento, la innovación o la excelencia, se encuentra siempre todavía por realizar. Quisiera preguntarme si las cada vez más habituales alianzas entre artistas y científicos, su encuentro en redes de innovación creativas, las plataformas que pretenden conectar procesos de innovación tecnológica, social y empresarial, son capaces de estar a la altura del desafío que supone ese particular retorno de los regímenes ético-estéticos. Esto, si se toman con todas sus consecuencias, si nos atrevemos a afirmar la dimensión disensual que contienen, significan una transformación en las condiciones de la economía y la política del conocimiento que no se ajustan a las reglas económicas de la propiedad y el intercambio capitalista. Aunque a menudo estas iniciativas tienen como punto de partida la construcción común del conocimiento, debemos cuestionarnos, como ha advertido el antropólogo James Leach en sus incisivas investigaciones de campo sobre las colaboraciones entre ciencia y arte, por qué en estos contextos cooperativos suelen reaparecer finalmente cuestiones relacionadas con la propiedad, las patentes, la acreditación, la autoría de las ideas y los conceptos, los objetos y artefactos que se generan en tales encuentros. Si queremos salir del juego capitalista entre la promesa y su inmediata abstracción en el intercambio mercantil de una comunidad de conocimiento no propietario, transnacional e interdisciplinar, es necesario cuestionarse qué significa pasar de un modelo de conocer y experimentar el mundo girado no ya hacia las obligaciones de la separación y la representación, sino volcado sobre la co-constitución y la copertenencia igualitaria entre visualidad, materialidad, objetos, cosas, conceptos, palabras, imágenes, discursos, artefactos. El reto es entender que el encuentro desregulado entre mundos humanos y inhumanos, entre diferencias culturales, entre perspectivas disonantes, demanda la revisión de una variedad de conceptos, desde el de creatividad al de conocimiento mismo, pasando por los de colaboración o innovación. Y se trata también, para terminar, de la puesta en cuestión reflexiva de nuestros propios lenguajes descriptivos e interpretativos, para reconocerlos, en primer lugar, como formas de apropiación y sujeción de la alteridad y la diferencia. Gracias, y perdón por la rapidez.
Gracias. Gracias.
Hello. Good afternoon. I'm just putting some film I'd like to talk about in the a bit later. I will let it read and then. I'd like to thank the event for accepting my proposal. I prepared a text in order to save some time. This presentation is a first trial to translate my PhD research project into an argument, but at the same time, it marks too. I'm looking for works where the mouth and the anus appears. But at the same time, I cannot deny that I have a hypothesis, a kind of intuition yet, I must admit, that the presence of the mouth and even more of the anus in contemporary art could challenge the traditional hermeneutical approach to art. Cooking, that is this kind of first piece of artwork I found and is part of my cartography, is going, that's why I'm saying that it's also the beginning of this cartography. It's the film I'm going to present in the last part of the presentation. Firstly, I'd like to talk a bit about the origins of this project and of its theoretical background. The idea for the project, named as this paper, The Mouth and the Anus, New Tools for Art Criticism, came up in a very particular political context that seems important for me to explain in order to make you understand why I'm dealing with this. Last year in Brazil, where I'm from, during the wave of protests that maybe you knew about, a group of very conservative politicians, most of them from the neo-Pentecostal church, began to appear in Brazilian media to promote some of their most controversial proposals that consisted basically in take a step back in some rights recently acquired by sexual minorities in Brazil, like the gay marriage, for instance. As a counter-movement, a number of slogans emerged, putting the anus as a privileged locus to understand these new political clashes. The verse of the Brazilian poet Adélia Prado that says coelindo, and it means literally something like anus is beautiful, became an emblem of these resistance movements and have been written in walls of several cities in Brazil, along with this other slogan that says meu cu é laico, and it means my anus is secular. That is more, of course, directly related to these promiscuous relationships between body, politics, and religions in Brazil right now. This biopolitical crisis put literally the problem of political representation, I think. What can be verified in another slogan that was very current at that moment, that politician X, Y, or Z, and of course you can change the name according to your political reality, I'm sure you can find some equivalent, does not represent me. Of course, I can have a bit of water. Of course, my main interest here is to face the ways the presence of the mouth and the anus in contemporary art can or effectively changes the hermeneutical approach that seems to be hegemonic, at least for me, in academic art critics. So I won't spend so much time going back to this whole representational question that's aesthetic and political, of course. But what seems interesting to me in these events is just this tension that was very polarized between the Protestants and the rest of Brazilian citizens. Because in this context, it was impossible for me not to remember the book from Hans-Ulrich Gombrich called Production of Presence, in which the Protestant reform is postulated as the modern turning point towards the epistemological privilege of hermeneutics. In one of the examples provided by Gombrich in order to formulate the main idea of his book, he underlines how different are the logics operating in the Catholic communion liturgy. This is the body of Christ, that means it's a presence, and in the Protestant one, this is like the body of Christ, I mean, this is a representation. Despite recognizing that no culture, because the main argument of Gombrich is that there are cultures of presence and cultures of representation, but he recognized that there's no culture marked exclusively by the presence or by representation. You know, it's like much more complex, much more mixed. But even though some historical periods are, you can see the preponderance of some of them. And contemporaneously, he thinks we can diagnose the interpretation as the privileged intellectual academic gesture. Well, so another example of a culture of presence provided by Gombrich concerned to the Amerindians' anthropophagic rituals. To it, literally, the body of the enemy cannot be understood out of the materiality implied in this ritual, even if, at the same time, there is a conceptual difference remarked by the Brazilian writer Oswald de Andrade, but also by Pierre Clastres, the French anthropologist, between anthropophagy, that is a ritual by which the relationship with otherness is complexly elaborated through eating the other's own body, and cannibalism, or what Oswald calls low anthropophagy, that is a practice that takes place where there are hunger, so due to some economical reasons. Hans Staden, a German soldier who was kept prisoner of the Tupinambás in Brazil for 9 months in the 16th century and was almost ate by this tribe, could escape and had the opportunity to report some very curious facts that help us to understand anthropophagy in its relations to what I would call here, in a very risk situation, because I just created it for communicate what I mean, a material otherness, and by which I mean, you know, alterity in this most genuine sense, you know, this alterity that cannot be idealized or integrated as some multiculturalism perspectives predict, you know, this irreducible difference. Well, Staden wrote in his journal that once, while watching a Tupinambá, one of these Indians from America, while watching this Tupinambá eating the thighs of another human, he told, "Not even the most wild animals eat animals from the same species. How can you, a man, to eat another man?" And the answer of this Amerindian is at least disturbing for an hermeneuticist. The Indian replies, "I'm a jaguar, and it tastes good." The notion of identity that lies under the moral anxiety of Staden about cannibalism is itself problematic in the dialogue. In totemic societies, as the Amerindians, as the Tupinambá, the personal identities are more ambiguous and fluid than it is in the modern societies, in modern states, represented by this Staden's discourse. To be a jaguar doesn't mean does not mean to be like a jaguar or to represent a jaguar. All sorts of rituals that permeate the daily life of one tribe transfer to their members some trace and ability of its totems. An Indian from a tribe which totem is the jaguar can, in some occasions, eat human meat, but will never eat a jaguar, because it would be not anthropophagy, it would be autophagy, because to eat jaguar is to eat yourself. The classical Manifesto Antropófago, written by Oswald de Andrade in 1928, inscribes in its own title a subtle ambiguity that fundaments our hypothesis. This manifest is not just about anthropophagy and its representations. The text is in itself an anthropophagos. And it's important to underline here that I'm not going to quote, I don't know how many time I still have, but I'm going to jump some more parts. I've been cutting a lot of quotations, but so I just would like to say that if anthropophagy gave me the first tool to rethink art criticism, that is the mouth, you know, this way, this fold that confounds you about inside and outside, and yourself and the other, it seems quite interesting to me that where the anthropophagical process ends, I mean, through the anus, by defecating and farting, wherever, has been quite neglected in the critical fortune of modernist anthropophagy. I suspect that it's not because of anal functions did not play an important role between Amerindians. I tend to think that it comes from a context of privatization of the body, very well summarized by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in L'Antiétude. And I quote, "Our modern societies have undertaken a vast privatization of the organs. The first organ to suffer privatization, removal from the social field, was the anus. It was the anus that offered itself as a model for privatization." And then I will just show 1 minute of the Tunga films, and then I will just comment shortly. There's no song that's... Oh, I can show while I speak. Have to pay attention because it's a bit strong and I want to cut, to censor in one part, in precise part. So based on this Deleuze and Guattari quotation, I'd like to, I will so, you know, the anus offered itself as this model for privatization. To think about the anus, taking into consideration the historical movement of its privatization, as pointed by Deleuze and Guattari, seems to imply the impossibility of the anus as a sign, in a semiotic meaning, as a sign. The presence of the anus in Brazilian demonstrations I started my presentation talking about seems to point towards its function as a strategical opponent to the whole logic of representation. And that's a bit like how I would summarize my hypothesis, that the anus, when it appears, it doesn't mean anything. It's always meaningless, or it has always a lot of meaning in a way that you cannot get it. Then in my text, I present a bit this essay from Bataille, La Nuit Solaire, the sunny anus, because in this text he seems to provide this notion that the anus and the organism as a whole is built up on a regime of force that resonates in other levels. So he thinks like the human body and the social movements and the geology and the astronomy, they think it all like reverberating, and then the Nuit Solaire, that is the name of the book, the essay, is the universe itself, because this constriction and this circularity somehow is related to Bataille. It resonates with the anus shape and functions, as the Vulcans, for instance. I would like to talk more. I think my time is over. This film is very short, very briefly. It's a film, as you can see, it's a heterosexual couple. They are having a sexual and, after a while, a eschatological relationship. In the first moment, this crystal will melt, and the guy will wake up, and it was a dream. And then they will start again to the preliminaries for an intercourse, and again he is with the crystal. His penis never appears. It's the crystal, but then she breaks the crystal by purpose. And after that, I will be very rude in my description because there's no other way to do it. Then she will pee on the crystals, and he will eat the crystals. And after, he will defecate, and the crystal will be completely broke in his feces. And after that, she will eat his feces. And when she finally defecates, she defecates the whole crystal as it is now. And what I'd like to say is that the critics, the critical reception of this film, that's a very prestigious and very awarded film, show that the organic complexity mise-en-scène by Tunga could not be interpreted without some scandal, some scandalized vision or moral at some level. That's why I think that this more cosmological perspective proposed by Bataille in this very particular case of Tunga's film could help us to stand in front of this film, not trying to interpret him, but much more in the way we stand in front of a volcanic landscape, for instance, that just help us to rethink about the centrality of our anthropocentric and anthropomorphical beliefs in the world and in the material world and in humanity, whatever. That's it. I'm sorry for having passed the time. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you all, thank you to the organizers, and thank you all for still being here. Thank you, the last presenter, for keeping you awake, because now I have all your attention. I don't need any teasers to to wake you up anymore. You're all aroused, so we all pay very much attention, which is bad. I was counting on this time to be, I can say anything that I can skip. So I won't read. I might sacrifice some depth and actually some coherence in what I'm saying, but I think this is the result of a 5-year research project, so it would have to be shrunken anyway to fit into a 15-minute slot of attention. So I'd be very pleased to send you a download link for my thesis if you're interested in seeing it or seeing the 2 DVDs that are attached to it. I'm a visual artist, so I produced artworks. I've done some bioart works before, and I'm still working in the field of art and science, I can say. And I didn't do any artworks that dealt with living material except people in my research project, because I had to deal with the constraints of a PhD project in between 2 different country universities, and with the constraints of funds. And when you have to do projects that involve other people, collaborations, and materials that you cannot price at the beginning of the project, you have to have a budget for it. You can't just rely on maybe I can get funds for it. And actually, it has another constraint, which is ethical constraint. And you cannot expect to resolve the time that ethical committees might take to approve projects if you have the time frame of a research project within a university. So I had to go through 2 different committees to be able to work with people, and that was enough. Okay, so I had the privilege to work within a hospital and a molecular biology lab. I was searching for ways of dealing with memory, how science was dealing with memory studies. So the field is too broad, and I couldn't encompass the possibility of looking at how memory is studying in many different fields of science. So I decided to work with a tiny field that is not tiny at all, which is loss of memory, and specific loss of memory caused by dementia, caused by Alzheimer's disease. So I started working with 2 different groups that were researching dementia, or specifically Alzheimer's disease. One was researching the molecular possibility of developing drugs, pharmaceutical treatments. The other was multidisciplinary group already, because it was dealing with the clinical part of it. So we had anthropologists, psychologists, neuropsychologists, psychiatrists, neurosurgeons, neurologists, people that were dealing with the patients in the clinics, memory clinics. It was a practice-based research. I produced 4 interrelated artworks that were not one work, but sometimes there were several, and I'll show some. So I'll skip. I've related the art practice to other artists that were working not in the same field, but with similar problems, and they were Susan Hanker, Mark Dian, and Helen Chadwick. Of course, Helen Chadwick is not. Methods I've used were familiar to my own art practice, and I took a kind of an ethnographic approach, more like a Latourian kind of approach. So I went into the lab, and the aims were to evoke the nature of autobiographical memory, explore representational strategies, explore what connections could be established between, okay, my practice, which is visual, and the scientific research on the same theme, but through a completely different approach, of course. So I decided to bound to 4 key elements. So the number 4 is not a Kabbalistic, it comes many times, but it's not for any particular reason. And so the words were montage, visual, ordering, and archiving. And I also had to introduce, of course, some theory. So I've introduced some theory on memory, on autobiographical memory, some debates on Alzheimer's disease, some debates on visuality and looking at, and of course some debates on technology and biotechnology. But I'll skip because I want to get to, not to the theory or to the philosophy, but to the artworks. So this, you can see, were my main philosophers that helped me conceptualize. So you can't see from there. But basically, Michel Foucault and Bruno Latour concepts were from Foucault, heterotopia and panopticon. So birth of the clinic, birth of the prison, and from Bruno Latour, basic inscription and actor network theory. So not just from Latour. So these are images that correspond to my 4 archival spaces. Of course, they're not really archival spaces. You can see here they are kind of philosophical archival spaces. And the space is the patient space, my art studio, the Alzheimer Research Dementia Lab, and the Cellular Molecular Alzheimer Research Laboratory. They were both located in Lisbon. The university was in England, and I had a studio, one in England, one in Lisbon. So I wanted to mimic not just the physical and real connection that a patient has to go when his disease becomes institutionalized and he becomes part of a network that implies different people, different ecologies, different places, but also what I was leaving to go from one laboratory to another studio to another studio to one university to another university. So I had to do a lot of moving. So the circulation becomes something that was important. Circulation as mobilization between inscriptions in between these labs. They had to communicate. Patients were under clinical trials for different treatments for Alzheimer. So they also produced a lot of documentation and a lot of experimentation that had to circulate in between labs. So installations were produced with this in mind, okay? Collection of me as an ethnographer there, not interfering with their research, which was like serious research. This is in brackets as if mine wasn't serious. And so I'll proceed. So the chapter headings correspond to actually the titles that I gave to the main installations. So the first one is the approach, and this was before I had ethical approval to be in contact with patients. I didn't require ethical approval to be in contact with cell lines in the labs, because I had the approval of the scientists and the director of the institution, and I wasn't bringing outside any living material. So that I jumped as not in previous research. So this was made from archived files that were already in the public domain of previous patients that had to go through MRIs and X-rays and other brain scans. And so what I did was I've constructed an assemblage of these images in the shape of a Cézanne landscape that I had in my studio. So I went in through a drawing and collage process to construct this landscape in glass. Then had a slide projector connected to it that was triggered by the presence of the viewer. And the slide projector was projecting nothing but light, but seemed to breathe, because it was in autofocus and it was trying to focus. But because this was glass and was kneeling towards a wall, and there was no white printed in the glass, so the light would go through and will fit. It could sense the glass with some black image and gray images, and then the wall with the white, so it kept resonating between one another and it almost could breathe. As I was missing the patient, I implied the viewer as the living in there. These are images from also the approach, but from other works, which are as also glass, but glass as pictures, if you want. So also assemblage of the images from these different archival spaces with no white, hanged close to the wall, but not touching the wall. So anything that was as a vestige of previous exhibitions on the wall would be integrating the image. The second work and the second chapter is the archive, and dealt with all the issues that mean and are implied in constructing an archive. And an archive of a medical and scientific research is big. It has a lot of ethical restrictions, and especially if it's for drugs that are still on trial. So I become a kind of a silent observer that were allowed. So I was actually the only person in the entire, probably I could say in the entire world, because this was a worldwide investigation of these new drugs. And nobody was entitled to see what others were produced in their own archive. Imagine like the ones that injected the drug and they had to follow what were the patient's reactions to the drugs. Was a team, right, of nurses and technicians and neurologists. And then you had the psychiatrists on the neuropsychological assessment. And they could not see what were the results of the other. Then you had the other ones that did MRIs, and they produced their notes. And some neurologists, of course, saw more of what was produced in all the fields, but they could not reach the entire information because they were not there to see how the archive of the other group was built. And I was going through all this, which implied, of course, a lot of careful in the way that I was editing the work and presenting it to public. So the archive became very complex to me, and although I thought I would do one big work that would just increase in size towards the end of the research, I ended up doing several works that represented the archive. These are some video stills from one of the projects that I did to the Natural History Museum. This is another work that I did there. The ones that can read Portuguese understand it says, don't allow me to forget about me. It's what the post-it says. And then it has talcum powder in the floor with some personal objects. This was for another exhibition. It's called the Archive / Drawing the Invisible. This was presented at a science museum, well, actually Pavilhão do Conhecimento in Expo in Lisbon, and it was for an exhibition that was the image in art and science, and they particularly wanted something that was dealing with the idea of the invisible and what was not attainable through any material. But of course in the lab, even something that is visible is invisible, and even in a patient that is completely physical, what you want to see is invisible until maybe the patient is dead. And even when the patient is dead, and that is something that I describe in an annex of the research documents, is when you actually are able to see the brain after the patient is dead. And I had the opportunity to go in the neuropathology lab to observe 2 inspections of not living, but brains, like whole brains that were sliced and analyzed, dissected and analyzed, and then subjected to a lot of histology processes. It's really striking, because then suddenly you are reduced to something that is material and supposedly is the beginning of the whole sensation we have of being alive and experiencing and thinking. But then it's something that is so, I don't know, so apparently simple, but it's so magical, and you are not sure if you want to touch it or not. And I wrote 6 pages when I got out of the experience. I went to another room, I didn't want to talk to anybody, and the world seemed to change then. So I didn't just had the contact with the patient, but then I had the contact with what was produced by the patient, and then I had the contact with 2 patients that I knew that were already dead, and they donated their brains to the whole research. So it was a life-changing, I would say, experience, a humbling experience. I decided to go, and this is where it started, I decided to go into enactment of the archive while I was circulating into the labs and the studio, and then a reenactment of the archive that I'll show you a slide about it, when I was editing and transforming the material that was collected in the labs into art form. So it was not just an aesthetization, or it was not at all an aesthetization of science, because I was leaning on what science was producing, the way they were producing, the technologies and the procedures, the protocols that the science was following to produce science. But I was also, and I was transferring that into the gallery, of course, but I was also reenacting what happened in the lab, in the studio. So I submitted myself 4 years or 3 years and a half to self-assessment sessions, where I would go to the same processes that patients undergo when they are being tested. So I would not take the drugs. So I didn't want to become a control. I didn't even reach the age that I was able to become a control, although I offered at a certain point. But I did the same drawings and the same questionnaires that the patients would have to go for 2 hours every time they would go into the clinics in myself, and I recorded that. So I used those videos to produce new work. I also projected the images, that the sentences that the patients had to write in a chalkboard, in one of those blackboards that school uses to teach, or used to use to teach us how to read and write. And I've projected their sentences and their drawings, and I traced their drawings. But of course, I was doing a memory exercise, because while I was tracing the drawing or the sentences, I was enabling the light to go through my hand, so I had to rememorize where the A was, or where the drawing was. The archive also became a performance that I did at a molecular biology laboratory in the hall. So for a whole week, which was the European Week of the Brain, and they asked me to do something. I didn't want to go away from what I was doing, so I said, okay, then I'll bring the studio here, and this whole week I'll go to patient assessment, etc., whenever it's scheduled, but when it's not scheduled, I'll be here in the lobby, where actually the bar is, and I will be doing what I would be doing in the studio. So I mimicked the 4 different archival spaces as a performance in there. So I've built different tables with different materials corresponding to the different archival spaces, and I performed there. So I was doing the self-assessment there, of course sometimes interrupted because scientists would come, or the cleaning lady would come and ask what I was doing. I said, just have a seat, see, or ask anything. And they started interacting with what I was doing. And that was because I started thinking about what Latour was saying about the non-hierarchical as a representation of anything that was going on in the lab. So anything that goes in the lab can be an actant, so something that is unimportant at a certain moment, and then can become an actor and completely vital in another moment. So this was part of the archive. Then I had the assessment, which turned out to be a video. It's a 2-screen video, which has these kind of images of all the assessment materials you can't imagine, but if you read my CDs, you can. The different kind of materials that become props, and the video looks like this. So with 2 different screens, each screen mingles 2 different archives. And then the last work is a therapy. The therapy was presented in 2 different exhibitions. One was in the Natural History Museum, where I assembled the works that I've done before, plus others like drawings that I was building in the studio, and a new piece that was this bottom left and top right. It was done proposedly with therapeutic elements, so like memory triggering exercises that I've built it based on the ones that the scientists were using, or like attention triggers, like loops in the video were never the same, so they would accelerate and some images would change. So the viewer that would see the exhibition at 9 in the morning when it opened, or at 8 in the evening when it closed, had completely different perspectives of what was there, because the video kept changing slightly, of course. And the last exhibition, so I'm finishing, the last exhibition was Trace. I've shown Trace also this year in Brazil, but it was based on the previous exercises that I've done before with the tracing, but this time I did 3 large screens, like these size screens, but I had 3 of them, where in the middle I would mix different layers of me drawing in different perspectives. And it's a pity that you can't really see the work, or even videos, because it would take time. And so I'll just leave you with this image, or no, I have to leave you with the image of the sponsors of the entire research, because we're always supposed to do this. And I hope we have questions in the end, because she says I am running out of time. So thank you all.
So my contribution to the theme of divergent history, starting from matter, comes from my perspective as a practicing artist, with an interest in the creative affective tensions and processes between subjects, objects, apparatus and environment, and how these generative effects bring artworks into being, leaving an impression within the artwork. Okay. Can you hear me okay? So, as the history of objects is increasingly being understood as more vital than that of text, of social, cultural and political actions and narratives, we're finding new narratives that can triangulate between artefacts, matter and human experience. The current strands of media archaeological approaches to the study of objects provide access to the non-linear history of material networks, non-human histories of technologies, arts and media, compromising a play amongst a plurality of material and non-material agents. So my work is not media archaeological, nor is it art historical, but it provides a method through which these new narratives may begin to be realised. And as such, this presentation will bring an arts perspective to this discussion, revealing many shared ideas with these discourses, but with a central focus on experience. So the divergent histories I want to talk about today are non-linear histories of unconscious processes, affective artefacts, and environmental conditions that bring an artwork into existence, with a specific focus upon the interrelationship between unconscious processes such as lived experience and matter, So this presentation will start on the premise that the material and immaterial are codependent and cannot be atomized or understood as separate domains. The neo-materialism that lies at the center of many discussions of material culture cannot be exclusively understood as properties of matter. These properties are experience and as such require the inclusion of a lived human experience. So what I'd like to present here is an artistic reflection upon immediate archaeology of an artifact using this particular photographer's context sheet and individual photographic images to elaborate upon the non-material effective forces that constitute the work's ontology. And by effective forces, I mean the consciousness of the artists, materials, and the technologies that bring the work into existence. So artistic methods used in the making, but also the reading of artworks, have a strong sympathy with a media archaeological approach to understanding the emergence of media technologies. In terms of making, an artistic method is a self-corrective process that happens across different levels of consciousness, and this provides a richer narrative between the artists, their experience, the materials, technologies, and the environment that result in the work. The writing of Monroe Beardsley in particular reveals the importance of the creative process within the arts and beyond, that generates its own direction and momentum. There is no such thing for Beardsley as a single guiding factor that results in a work of art. Rather, the creativity is a self-corrective process, both conscious and pre-conscious between the artist and the work, a constant redirection of aims that emerges through the activity of the artist with their materials. And any control of the outcome of the work is neither determined by the means or the ends for the artist. For within the materials being used, rather control is internal to the process itself. For Beardsley, this process is always an interplay between the conscious and pre-conscious, and between the maker and the work. So he quotes, once a work is underway, the creative process is kept going by tensions between what has been done and what might have been done. At each stage, there must be a perception of the deficiencies in what now exists, plus the sense of unrealized possibilities of improvement. The self-corrective process that bring a work into existence, leave a trace, and are expressed in the form of the work. I would like to illustrate how this narrative can release an artifact, such as a photograph, from the disciplinary boundaries set up by its discourse. So this reading will focus upon how unconscious processes of decision-making can be read within material artifacts through an archaeological study of a photographer's contact sheet from the perspective as an artistic method. Typically, the contact sheet is embedded and largely indistinguishable in discussions about authorship from the process of editing, since it is the template around which most editing starts, and usually the first sight of all the pictures taken on one roll of film. And Cartier-Bresson considers it to be the contact sheet rather than the prints, which reveal the photographer himself. In following the sequence as it builds towards the best picture, one sees the individual. And this authorship is not wholly intentional, but rather it is intuited, an unconscious process of decision-making during the event of taking the photographs. The photographer's decision to depress the shutter is greatly swayed by a much larger network, a collaboration of determinates, objects and subject matter. So this is a contact sheet by a magnum photographer called Jonas Bendixen from 2000, and it shows a section of a space rocket on a farm near Russia's main spaceport in Baikonur. And 10 years after he took the photographs, Bendixen is struck by how unaware he was of the significance of the event that led to the single iconic image that we see here. This is image 27 on the contact sheet. And and this is one that he used many times, particularly for the front cover of this book, Satellites. So this is a quote from him in Magnum Photography book. I hadn't looked at the contact sheet in years. As I cut it out, out my chosen frame and left the rest in an archival box I hardly ever used or accessed. Once I dug it out, I couldn't help laughing aloud. I was shocked but thrilled at what it showed, a complete unawareness of the magic that was swirling around me. In any case, here we were in a cloud of white butterflies, circling the remains of a Soyuz space rocket's second stage, while local farm boys were gutting it for usable scrap metal. So Kristen Lubin describes in the introductory remarks to the Magnum contact sheets, from which this contact sheet has come from, how placing a photographic image back into the context within a contact sheet invokes an instinctive sense of authenticity or proof. However, what I'm more interested in when placing the image, when the image is placed back into the flow of lived time of the entire contact sheet from which it was removed, as part of a sequence of images with black intervals in between, the photographer's inscriptions and the margin text showing the film stock type, these all provide empirical access through formal elements and enable an extended reading of the individual image. The following empirical forensic reading of the contact sheet through immediate archaeological study is intended to trace the immaterial dimensions, the cognitive processes of the photographer during the event, an event which includes the subject matter, the apparatus, the photographer, other people and objects, along with their possible mistakes and lucky coincidences that have brought the images into being. The contact sheet holds the capacity to bring forth an impression of an event which is not wholly reducible to the sum of the images held within it. The black interval strip that separates each frame shows up the tensions, differences, and discontinuity between each image and generates an effective space where the viewer becomes an active participant in reconstructing the event as it was unfolding. This affection lies in the absence, an absence only visible next to which is present or given in an image. It is here our imagination fills the blackout. We reconstruct the movements and decisions made by the photographer in relation to the changing position of the objects and subjects within two images either side of a black frame. So Jonas Bendixsen's contact sheet shows 38 coloured images, all but 3 featuring the same part of a fallen spacecraft on land at the same location. It's clear it's the same spacecraft from the way it's fallen and impacted the ground. The features on the front end are the same way up in every image. The first 24 images show us the object from different perspectives, which Bendixsen appears to animate through the captured movements around the spacecraft object, working towards an optimum alignment in order to momentarily grasp the equilibrium of the compositional dynamics. Bresson illuminates this from his first-hand experience. So this is a quote from Bresson. Sometimes a single event can be so rich in itself and its facets that it is necessary to move all around it in your search for the solution to the problem it poses. For the world is movement, and you cannot be stationary in your attitude towards something that is moving. So between image 23 and 24, which would be top right and bottom left, the discontinuity in the image shifts between the rural and a kind of wilderness. And the different objects depicted show a decision by Bendixsen to take a different perspective on this subject. Such a significant visual displacement tells us we've jumped forward in time as well as space. And this moment marks where one idea is brought to an end and another one begins. In everyday life, we experience a continuous stream of linked images. However, our incoming flow of images is constantly interrupted, quite naturally, by a train of thought. Our inner dialogue has things to interject about the flow of sensations, observations, memories, and desires, which it throws up against the present moment as it passes, and simultaneously presses upon what Cartier-Bresson calls the decisive moment. So the notions of an individual vision, of a search for balance and harmony, the methods of achieving it are all relevant to a discussion of this fabled decisive moment. And Jean-Claire described an aspect of the photographer's skill as being able to make predictions in a millisecond about what's about to happen next. He can do this because he remembers that he can predict. And there is an element here of the time being opportune yet pending, held in readiness, and thus the photographer who is all action is also poised before action. The instant being described here is one where the scene could fracture in any direction. The photographer is poised ready, already seeing the simultaneous multiple potentials and ready to dash in any direction. This element is the moment of hiatus and anticipation, and not of conclusion, and that which is just before a decision is made. So in frame 24, which is, the one here, top left, is Ben Dixon here has recognized this moment is already upon him. A cloud of white butterflies flood the scene. He receives this unfolding moment, shooting 12 frames in what appears like close succession. And what does it mean for the decisive moment? He has already worked the scene, but he could not have anticipated the storm of white butterflies, nor the diversion the horse takes across the road, nor the way in which other people and objects might have responded to the moment upon them. Cognition cannot be described through intentionality alone. It can be felt. A process of cognition that cannot be described as an intentional act. It is a resonance between affective objects, between people, landscape, that is a thinking that can be felt. The precariousness of how some of these photographs came into existence is striking. Not only because any one of these elements or agents might not have composed itself in a way that made the moment present itself to the photographer, or perhaps even the photographer might have responded too late. In the 12 frames from 24 to 35, where the peak of the event seems most distilled, the black strips between frames also have a greater affective quality. Here the strips provoke the reader to imagine what Ben Dixon almost shot. The infinitely divisible moments in between, where gesture, composition, and coincidence might have resulted in something even greater. It's here the images together with the gaps reveal something larger than the images themselves. The continuous images within the contact sheet provide access to this self-corrective process, a living direction and momentum that results in Ben Dixon's iconic image, that is both conscious and pre-conscious between the artist, their experience, the work, and the environment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My question is for Icaro, and I would like to ask you, what do you think about here? What do you think about artists who talk about the anus and the eating shit, like Pasolini, for example? Do they make society accept, or because of their radicality, they make society reject it even more?
No, well, I really don't know. I think, we have to study each case, you know. My methodological approach to think about the mouth and the anus as tools for art criticism is, in these works I'm working with, is to try to map all the critical fortune they create around them. So, of course, Salò of Pasolini is a classic. I don't know how it's not a easy film for seeing. It's hard, and it's well, somehow I think well, it's not. It does, of course, the Pasolini film doesn't make it more acceptable because even very, well-instructed people just cannot see the film. It's not related to education, or it's because it's really strong, and it's because I think the Pasolini film differently from Tunga's one, because Tunga's film is a love film. It's even if there is eschatology after watching, you will say, oh, it's a beautiful love story. I think Pasolini do right the opposite, using putting in somehow the same process in scene. But I don't know how if I answered or not. But I think in each case, we cannot generalize the use of cheating or the anus or anything, because I think each work will demand some approach. And what I'm trying to do is just to map it. Of course, it's very difficult, because when I told at the beginning, and I was telling that. But I have an hypothesis, because I know that the cartographical methodology, as postulated by Latour, that I know probably a lot of people here have read, propose that go and describe, and unfortunately I really cannot do it yet, but that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you.
Maybe just one more question.
Bueno, hola. Yo quería preguntar sobre el Chimbalab, pues, que, entendí que se hizo después del terremoto en Chile.
Perdona, ¿puedes hablar más fuerte, por favor?
Hola, ¿sí? ¿Me escuchan? Yo quería saber sobre el Chimbalab, el proyecto de la emisora, qué se logró, qué se emitió, y si el proyecto, por ejemplo, sigue ahora vigente, o en qué estatus está el Chimbalab.
Sí, te escuché. El proyecto de Chimbalab como colectivo ya no sigue existiendo. Están trabajando por separado. Se llama Claudia González y Constanza Piña. Constanza está trabajando en Buenos Aires y Claudia en Santiago. Y este proyecto lo hicieron en diferentes sitios. Luego lo hicieron incluso en Austria, en Linz, en un festival que se llama Livoli. Entonces en cada sitio, me imagino, en Linz, por ejemplo, la última imagen que enseñé era de una performance que hicieron transmitiéndola por la radio, me parece. Pero, bueno, eso, como colectivo se disolvió. Ellas también tenían otros trabajos, hacen mucha formación, muchos talleres. Pero puedes buscar por separado en internet, como lo que está haciendo cada una por separado ahora.
Bueno, for those who wants to go to listen to Chris Salter here at the CCCB, we can meet here in the door and we can go all together. So that's all for today, and later or tomorrow here. Thank you.